Okay, hello. This next video, we're going to go through the MP curve. Which really is the whole point of this module. And it's called the monetary policy curve because it reflects what the Fed does for their monetary policy. There's two things they're concerned about: output and inflation, because of their dual mandates. So if they're doing their job right, as inflation goes up, they'll increase interest rates to control that inflation. So we can draw this MP curve as just a straight line to show what the Fed is going to do if there's inflation. So as inflation increases, the Fed will raise R. Now, of course, they're going to actually raise little I, but as they raise little I, little r goes up too. This will cause a movement along the curve. Now, what happens if employment falls, GDP falls? Well, if GDP falls, the Fed wants to lower interest rates. So to be able to put this all on one graph here, what we'll do is say that if Y falls, the Fed is going to lower the interest rate down to here, which means that it's essentially a shift of this entire MP curve downward. So if Y decreases, the Fed will lower R, shown by a shift. A shift down in the MP curve. So that at the same inflation rate, R will be less. Now what I'd like to do is take both of these curves and the IS curve and the MP curve and put them together. Now, this is one way, this is the most common way of doing things, putting inflation on this horizontal axis, and then a movement, a change in inflation causes a movement, a change in Y causes a shift. But it could be done the other way too. We could put Y on the horizontal axis and have R changes because of Y and a shift because of inflation. Could be done either way, but this is a good way to do it. This is fine. Okay, so I'm going to put everything together here. First, I'll draw the IS curve, which has R up here and Y over here. Then I'm going to draw the MP curve. They don't both go on the same graph like the IS and LM do. So the MP curve has inflation here and R here. And then I'm going to draw the aggregate demand curve. But what I'm going to show you is that this will give us a downward sloping aggregate demand curve with inflation on the vertical axis and output on the y-axis. So let's say we are at some particular level of inflation. We'll call it pi 1 right here. And at pi 1, that means that inflation, or the aggregate demand, will give us an output, real output of y1. and at an inflation rate of pi 1, the Fed will set a real interest rate here. We'll call it R1. And at that interest rate R1, that will give us a particular level of investment that will correspond to Y1. Now, what I want to show you here is that as I change the inflation rate, it'll move along the aggregate demand curve. If inflation goes up, output will decrease, meaning that it's downward sloping. So let's do that. Let's say inflation goes up to pi 2, right here. What's going to happen to output? Well, if inflation goes up to pi 2, we can see what the Fed is going to do. They're going to start fighting that inflation by raising the real interest rate. So they raise it up to R2. And when interest rates go up to R2, higher interest rates make investment fall. And output then, we'll call it Y2, is less than Y1. So over here then, output Y2 is less than Y1. So we can see by changing the inflation rate, there's a movement along this aggregate demand curve. So if inflation increases, that means that R increases because of the Fed. And that makes Y fall because of the IS curve. So because of IS curve, investment falls, big I falls, which makes Y fall. So completely different reasons here as to why there's a downward sloping aggregate demand curve in this model. This is the ISMP model. With the difference between this one and the ISLM really is that there's inflation on the y-axis instead of price. And the reasons as to why it's downward sloping is completely different. So remember with the ISLM curve, the reasons for a downward sloping aggregate demand curve were the wealth effect and the interest rate effect. Because when prices drop, it essentially changes the money supply and how much wealth people have and changes interest rates. The reason here why it slopes downward is completely different. The reason why the aggregate demand curve slopes downward is because of the Fed. Higher inflation makes them raise rates, which slows down the economy. Now, I admit when I first saw this model, I wasn't that excited about it. Because I thought, well, this model depends on having a central bank. It depends on a Federal Reserve that has their dual mandates. You know, what if there's no central bank? Well, I guess we'd have to go back and use another model. But there's a lot of things I do like about it. It does model what the Federal Reserve does for monetary policy, and we do end up with an equilibrium at inflation, at some level of inflation. And the justifications for a downward sloping aggregate demand curve are a little bit easier to see. Okay, so what's the equation of this MP curve? Well, for simplicity, we just draw it as a straight line. The equation for a straight line is just y equals mx plus b, and we'll do the same thing. We'll set it to r equals r bar, which is the intercept, plus lambda times inflation. Just the equation of a straight line. So r bar would be the vertical intercept. And lambda will be the slope of the line. So this steepness here, steepness of this line, the slope is lambda. And then this y-intercept here is going to be r bar. So lambda sets the steepness of that line, which is really determines the sensitivity that the Fed is to changes of inflation. Lambda is exogenous, but if it's very steep, that means it's a Federal Reserve that cares a lot about inflation. A little bit of inflation makes them raise the interest rates a whole lot. A flatter curve means the Fed doesn't increase interest rates nearly as much when there's an increase in inflation. The R bar, so this is, we'll say like the sensitivity to inflation. By the Fed. And R bar is also exogenous. That shifts the curve up and down in relation to, or for a change in output, a change in Y. So Y drops, and then the Fed will just shift R bar down. So it reflects the Fed's mandate of maximum sustainable employment and is exogenous. So when the Fed is changing rates, in this model, they're doing it for two reasons. One's because of inflation, or one is because of maximum sustainable output. One causes a movement and one causes a shift. So movements are caused by a change in interest rates. So a movement is caused by a change in interest rates by the Fed in reaction to a change in inflation. So this is caused by a change in interest rates by the Fed, or the central bank, in reaction to a change in inflation. How much is determined by lambda, the slope of that line. Shifts in the MP curve are caused by a change in interest rates by the Fed in reaction to changes in GDP. So this is caused by a change in interest rates by the Fed in reaction to changes in GDP. So they're not going to come out and say, probably, oh, you know, we're moving it up here because of inflation. Well, they might say that, but we kind of have to figure it out. All we're going to see is a change in interest rates by the Fed. And then we're going to have to try to figure it out based on what they say, if it's causing a shift in the curve or if it's causing a movement in the curve. If they're raising the rates because of inflation, then it's a movement. If they're raising the rates because of the economy, then it would be a shift.